Welcome to Brain Pain, where we discuss everything psychology. I'm John, and like I always do, I want to remind you I am not a therapist. I'm a guy with a master's in psychology, and I'm working on a PsyD, which is the doctorate in psychology, with hope of eventually becoming a psychologist. And everything here that we talk about is not meant by any means to replace therapy. I highly encourage you to seek therapy if you think you need help or if you're just struggling. If you see others that need help or are struggling, please encourage them. Those of you who are watching this instead of just listening to it, if you're watching on YouTube or Rumble or Odyssey, I need a haircut. I got the flu shot this year, as I do every year because I'm required to for my job. And as almost every year, between 3 and 5 days later, I typically get ill. And I was ill. So just to be sure and just to be safe, I made sure that I have socially distanced and isolated myself from other human beings to ensure that I don't accidentally get them ill. And as such, I haven't gone to get my hair cut. Now, what does that have to do with today's subject? Absolutely nothing. Today we're going to talk about addiction. Addiction is a important thing to talk about because it's affected a lot of people in my world, people that I know directly. And what's really kind of crazy is that some of the best people I know are addicts. They're not actively in addiction. They're in recovery, but they are addicts. So let's talk about addiction. Now, for a lot of this, everything up at the beginning of this, everything I'm going to talk about in general is oriented around things like alcohol, cocaine, heroin, morphine, opioids, opiates. And I know some of you don't want to hear this, but there's a lot of studies that show this applies with marijuana as well. But don't worry, because at the end, I'm also going to talk about sugar, because that's also an addictive subject. Oh, and in the first part, we include nicotine in that addiction. So that's all these drugs are part of the addiction. And a lot of this applies to sugar as well. I just know that sugar is sometimes looked at a little differently, simply because it is food or food-ish. So how do people get addicted? Wow, that's probably an individual path for every single person. But there's some key elements to addiction. When we discuss addiction, we discuss nurture versus nature. And I'm a big fan, if you've listened to this podcast, of epigenetics. And epigenetics is where people's genes manifest in the environment. So that means that two people with the exact same genes put into two extremely different environments may manifest differently. The probability of using drugs in the first place is all about your environment, because of two key reasons. One is, are the drugs accessible? Can you get them? Now, there are people that will say, oh, anywhere in the United States you can get drugs. But I'll tell you, because I did not live in that world, I would have no idea where to go to get drugs initially. I mean, I'm sure if I really applied myself, I could figure it out. But obviously that's not really my goal personally anyway. But I wasn't really around it much until high school. And in high school, I wasn't directly around drugs. Alcohol, yeah. Every party we went to my senior year, my junior year in high school, had alcohol at it. But the real drugs, I knew who was using them or experimenting with them. I wasn't particularly close to those people, so it didn't really matter to me. And I also was at the time, focused on wrestling in high school and band and music and those kind of things, which comes into the second part of this, which is it acceptable? Now, I'm sure there were probably people on the wrestling team that smoked marijuana, smoked weed, right? I have no doubt, but it wasn't around me, and in general, it was frowned upon because for no other reason than it inhibited your wrestling abilities or at least your ability to train and stay focused. So in our at least the point is that in our group, in our peer group, it was not acceptable. My parents, it was not acceptable to do drugs. So, I mean, not that I couldn't have, but it was frowned upon. It was not something that was encouraged or tolerated. Well, I shouldn't even say tolerated. It just wasn't encouraged. Genetics have a lot more to do with addiction than people say, oh, you have an addictive personality. Well, it's not so much the personality. Genetics aren't a pass for being addicted to something because it's more about a probability. If you experiment with drugs, then only a small percentage of people are actually end up addicted. And genetics will give you a higher probability or a lower probability of being addicted, with the exception of hallucinogens. So they kind of are their own thing. For the purposes of this podcast, I'm not going to go into them so much. If there's real interest, we can talk about it later. But genetics do play a part. Age also plays a big part. We've talked before about your brain being fully developed at the age of 25, roughly, average, right? So some people longer, some people sooner. And with your brain not being fully developed, one of the things that happens in brain development is your prefrontal cortex actually deals with your risk decision. So do you have a higher tolerance for risk or a lower tolerance? That comes from your prefrontal cortex development. And where it is at the time you decide to experiment with drugs or expose to drugs. They like to use the term risk inhibition, which means you have breaks. Whereas anyone that's been 15 to 18 understands that sometimes you didn't always make the best choices when you were younger. That's why I say back in my wild and crazy days, a lot of people say that, and it's because we literally have less inhibition when we're younger due to our brains. So if you have a teenager out there and they're trying to drive you crazy, just know that part of that is the prefrontal cortex not being fully developed. So you can harass them about their small prefrontal cortex, I guess. So we've covered genetics, we've covered age, we've kind of covered your surroundings and your settings. But how do we actually become addicted? What's the real driving force in that addiction? Well, operant conditioning. Most people, I won't say everyone, most people have heard of Pavlov's dogs and ring a bell and they salivate because they expect food. That is a big mechanism of how addiction works. So before I go any further, I may mention the two terms positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Now, this is not how most people interpret it. Positive reinforcement is where you get something good from the act. So I get high, and if I'm high, I feel good. So that's a positive reinforcement. A negative reinforcement is to take something away. So if I have terrible feelings, if I'm not happy with myself, if I'm not happy with my life, and I get high, it takes away the negative feelings, which is a negative reinforcement. So just in case I start doing that scientific speak like that, you'll understand what I'm talking about. Again, positive reinforcement, I get something good. Negative reinforcement, I take something bad away. It's real simple. If A happens, B is my result. In the case of drugs, if I use drugs, I get high or I get numb so I don't have to feel the negative things. This reinforces the behavior. And for drugs, specifically hard drugs, the quicker you get to the point of being high or loaded or whatever you want to call it, the stronger the reinforcement. This is why if you offer two people heroin and morphine, if they have been using hard drugs, they'll typically end up sticking with the heroin as long as they can. Now, in the brain, heroin and morphine end up being the exact same thing as far as the brain's concerned. The difference is that the heroin can pass through the blood barrier more quickly, giving you a quicker high, which is more desirable for someone who's addicted. They want the quick high so that they can either stop feeling the things that they felt or start feeling the good feelings, or a combination of the two. So the quicker this high, the stronger the reinforcement. That's how people move from maybe ingesting to snorting to putting a needle in their arm. The quicker high becomes more important. So I think everybody understands the concept of what dopamine does in the system. It makes you feel good. And there's a release of dopamine in the brain that feeds this, and that's your positive or negative reinforcement. That dopamine gets rid of the bad feelings, builds you with good feelings. But when you get that positive reinforcement, then you start to associate the positive or negative reinforcement, whichever, with the ritual around how you do your drugs. So for someone who smokes cigarettes, let's talk about nicotine. Let's get away from the hard drugs that we've been talking about. Let's talk about nicotine. There's a number of people who, once they quit smoking, they struggle with things to do with their hands and that ritual they would go through, pulling out a cigarette and lighting it. It was a whole ritual that they were addicted to, not just the release of dopamine when the nicotine hit their system. From people that I know and love who have dealt with other addictions, there's similar stories. The ritual of obtaining your drug of choice, the ritual of preparing to take it, and the anticipation of that high, that release of dopamine, all part of the addiction. So we get this dopamine release in a part of the brain that you'll never remember the name of, but if you really want to know, drop me an email at john@brainpain.us, and I'll make sure I get you all the details on the super nerdy parts of the brain that are affected. But basically, we release this dopamine, and it ends up going into another section in the prefrontal cortex. Now, most people have heard of the prefrontal cortex, so I will use that. It's actually a subsection of that, but I'm not going to get bogged down in that. And eventually, if the drugs are used long enough, that part of the brain will change. So when someone who's been a long-term drug addict is no longer using, functional MRIs will show lower prefrontal cortex activation than in someone who has not been addicted to drugs. Now, what does this change? The change is really two-part. One is it makes you more sensitive to dopamine up until you've maxed it out, and it reduces all the things that inhibit dopamine release and sense. So basically, it's like, jacking up the amplitude of the dopamine sensors, and then anything that would inhibit that sense is reduced. So it's twofold, and then that's how your brain permanently changes. Now, as we said, this change happens in the prefrontal cortex, and the prefrontal cortex deals with risk inhibition, or your risk decisions. How likely are you to take that big risk? Well, I don't know. How likely are you? But it feeds into that whole snowball effect that, okay, now my center of control for risk has been compromised, my prefrontal cortex. It's changed because of my drug abuse, which makes me less likely to stop my drug abuse. Big snowball effect. Now, I want to talk about some things that work. Okay, I want to talk about things that work for treatment, specifically of drug addictions. I have seen friends of mine successfully navigate their addiction with the help of 12-step programs. Big believer. I know people who deal with alcohol addictions that are in recovery, and AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, has been their savior. Now, they still had to go to the counseling. They might even have other things that drove them to drink. I don't know the details, none of my business. I'm just happy to see that they are in recovery. I have friends, as I've said, that are in recovery for narcotics, and happy to see they're there. And they have found the ability to stay clean by embracing Narcotics Anonymous. They work. If you're dealing with alcohol addiction, if you're dealing with narcotic addiction, I highly encourage you to go find your local group and be very active in it. Find those people that have successfully navigated their recovery to a point where they're no longer an active user. And they will help you gladly. They'll be thrilled to do it. So I can't encourage that enough. That's a big deal. I am fairly certain for any addiction, you can probably find a 12-step group that would be very helpful. The two I'm familiar with is Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. That's why I talk about them. All right, let's talk about sugar. Sugar. Sugar's in everything in the United States. They did, and it might have changed since, but this is about 10 years ago. There was an article I read about a large fast food chain in the United States, which I won't mention. No clowning around. The only item on their menu that did not have sugar added to it was the salad without dressing. And it was only one or two of the salads, because some of those salads had, I think, either cranberries or sugar-coated nuts in them. So there's like only one or two items on the entire menu that did not have sugar in them. Oh, and the diet sodas, which, well, I'm not even going to go there today. But the thing is the average American at least eats way too much sugar. I think, just a second, I'll tell you. I'm going to look right now and tell you what they say the numbers are. So the doctors say you should have about, this is for women, they say 6 teaspoons of sugar, which is about 25 grams, and men 9 teaspoons, which is about 38 grams. In America, the average consumption per consumer is about 17 teaspoons, which they don't give me in grams, but you do the math, it's about, well, it's more than the combination of, it's, 2 teaspoons more than than a man and a woman combined. So they say a soda or a pop or a Coke or a Pepsi, 20 ounces has 16 teaspoons of sugar in it by itself. Apple juice, 20-ounce bottle of apple juice in America, 14.5 teaspoons of sugar. They show a fruit smoothie, which is advertised as healthy, having 12.2 teaspoons of sugar in it. So they have the common signs of sugar addiction, which is you try to hide your sugar addiction from others. You crave or are preoccupied with sugars or sweets when not eating it. You get withdrawal symptoms if you don't eat enough sugar. You eat sugar when you're not hungry. You feel guilty about the amount of sugar you eat. You use sugar to self-medicate. This is the same as self-medicating with other drugs. And at some point you start eating more sugar because the normal amount of sugar you used to eat isn't enough to satisfy your need. So sugar addiction, with it, has some health issues besides just the weight gain that is typical, the insulin issues, because it will spike your insulin. It will cause your ability to store fat to be incorrect. It can lead to diabetes. There's a lot of health issues with sugar. But two of the big ones are sugar addiction is connected to or can increase depression and anxiety. Now, we're talking about excessive sugar here. We're not talking about hitting the normal daily amount that they're talking about, the 6 or 9 teaspoons. We're talking about eating, like a lot of Americans do, a bunch of sugar every day, and then we wonder why we have higher rates of anxiety and higher rates of depression. Now, I think most people that have listened to my podcast understand that I have changed my schedule so that I get my exercise in the mornings. I have changed my diet to reduce the amount of, a number of things, bad things. I say bad things. To reduce a number of things that I don't feel benefit me in my diet, including a reduction of carbs, which naturally reduces sugar. What a lot of people miss is that a lot of fruit is high in sugars. They're natural sugars, but it's still sugar. And these can certainly feed into a sugar addiction. Now, there are places to get help if you have a sugar addiction. I would suggest you go online. I have not had to deal with them myself. I simply reduced the amount of sugar and carbs that I take in. But sugar addiction is a real thing, and in America especially, it's becoming more and more of a thing that we don't talk about because there's too many people making a lot of money off of feeding Americans basically fat with a lot of sugar in it. So very calorie dense, very sweet. And I mean, this comes from evolution. When we were hunter-gatherers, which wasn't all that long ago in history, we didn't always have food every day. There's some people in the world who still don't have food every day. So when we did get food, we would have a taste for fat, which is calorie dense, and sweet, which is calorie dense. That way we would have the energy to make it through the next few days. And if we stored some fat, great, because that would help us get through and live a longer and probably better life. Now, obviously, just like some of our other survival instincts and tools that we've developed as humans, they can become maladaptive. And sugar is definitely one of those. I'm going to talk about one more thing on addiction that may lose me a lot of listeners. Video game addiction. Video games are very addictive. They allow us to release a lot of dopamine into our brains. I'm not saying video games are bad. I play video games. I just don't play them to excess. And I'm also not very good at them, just so we're clear. There are recovery centers for video game addiction where people go in and detox from video games. Same mechanism, operant conditioning. We go do something, we accomplish a goal in the video game, we get a dose of dopamine. We see cool characters, or we see a cool item, or a cool whatever it is in your video game. It happens. You get to control it. You move those pixels around. Dopamine. Truth is, it's not that much different than social media. In my mind, there may be technical differences that I'm unaware of, but when we find ourselves scrolling through Instagram or Twitter or Facebook or YouTube, I myself have limited my social media access to a couple times a day to go through and look at the things I want to look at. YouTube I do use for entertainment, or Rumble or Odyssey, any of the streaming platforms, but I do it intentionally. I have found myself in the past just looking for something to watch on one of those platforms. And that's where I know, wait a minute. Nope, this is not a good use of my time. I didn't check the people that I'm following. I'm not looking at new content that is specific interest to me. I'm just wandering around trying to get some more dopamine released in my brain. Now, sometimes that's okay. And this is why it becomes difficult, because sometimes, hey, I've got an hour where I'm not obligated to do anything. Maybe I want to look and see if there's something new and interesting that I have never looked at. So I have to go look for it, see if it's out there. But it can become addictive. Years and years ago, for me personally, and this is just me, when I first started this battle of health and trying to lose weight and get healthy and all of those things, it started because I found myself on a Saturday afternoon sitting on a couch in Miamisburg, Ohio, watching Dirty Jobs. Now, I love Dirty Jobs. I really am a big fan of Mike Rowe. But I was watching the same Dirty Jobs I had seen at least 5 times before. And I was sitting there just to let the dopamine run through my soul. And I realized, why am I watching this? But I didn't want to pull myself away. I didn't want to get up and go do anything else. And so after that episode, I did finish the episode, and it turned out the same way as it did the first 5 times. I had a real long think about that. And that's when I got rid of my cable and got rid of direct television. Now, you got to realize when this happened, it was before we had all the entertainment options we have online. It was a struggle for me because I had a couple of things I really enjoyed on those platforms back when the internet was still growing and becoming what it is now. So it may be difficult for someone who is relatively young to capture how big a deal that was at the time. Some people just really didn't understand it that I knew, but the people that were close to me at the time supported it, thought it was a little strange, but supported it, and went from there. And the whole point of that is just about anything can become addictive. It's that operant conditioning. What is it that's releasing the dopamine into our systems? I would argue that watching Dirty Jobs is not as catastrophic as heroin, at least not in the short term, but it was leading me towards it already got me to obesity, possible diabetes, cardiac issues. Could have led me to all that. So I would just say that heroin's a lot quicker to all the negatives, but it was still addiction. And I think that within our lives, we can make our lives better by sorting out what we're really addicted to and what are we just doing for fun? Because when we feel compelled to do it or we don't feel okay, that's no longer fun. When we have to have it or we can't function and we're willing to sacrifice other parts of our lives that are meaningful and important, that means we have a problem and we really need to get at least some objective outside input. And at that point, you should probably talk to a therapist or go to a meeting, depending on what you're dealing with. I mean, obviously, if you're using cocaine and you can't stop, if you're using heroin and you can't stop, there's groups for that and you need to go. If you're having trouble with television, start tracking it. Talk to some people that you trust to give you an objective view of what you're doing. Find a third party. Talk to if you work for a big company, you may have an EAP program, Employee Assistance Program in the United States. You can go talk to a therapist for just about anything on the company dime for at least a few sessions. Get evaluated. But just check it out. A vast majority of people in the United States prior to television and video games and sugar didn't have to deal with addiction issues. But we're starting to see that number increase. And so it's just a thing to be aware of. And if anybody needs help, I highly recommend you reach out. Even if you don't know what group you need to go to. Go to a group. Find a meeting. Take that step. All right. Well, that'll be it for this week. But before I go, I want to talk about the end of the season. This season, I'm going to wrap up the plan is to wrap it up at the end of November. My podcasts lately have been hit or miss because I have been doing a lot of schoolwork. And I want to wrap it up and take December off and January off. And then we'll start again in February is the plan. Now, I still do plan to have guests on the show. I don't know if that'll happen at the end of the season or the beginning of next. Scheduling has been crazy. Like I said, I've been doing a lot of schoolwork. And so that has made it difficult for other people to be on the podcast simply because my schedule was too brutal. And we'll look forward to that, and we're going to go through, a number of other items. I've got a lot of things on my list of things I'd like to talk about on this podcast, but I'm also interested to hear what you might have to say, so please feel free to email me at john@brainpain.us if you're listening to the podcast. If you're looking online at my YouTube, Rumble, or Odyssey channel, then please leave a comment below. All right. Remember that I love you. Take care of yourself. Rock on.